Hi, I'm Tony Northup, and thanks for watching my Photoshop video training series. Today we're going to go over the Photoshop tools. Quickly, not too much detail, but just to familiarize you with the wide variety of tools that Photoshop has built in for you. Let's start at the top and work our way down. And if you don't see this toolbar here, go to the window menu and then select Tools. You can see it's selected right now, it'll appear. I also want to point out, depending on your screen, you might find it easier to tear this off and move it somewhere else. You can also make it 2 rows by clicking that button there. So I'll put it back to the left, and we'll start at the top here. The first one here is the Move tool. You can use the Move tool to move things, obviously. We have nothing to move right now, so it's going to give us an error. But if I select something with this Marquee tool that I'll cover in just a little bit, just draw a box around this. Now I have something selected, and when I select the Move tool, I can just move it around. This will make a lot more sense once you start doing more perfect selections and once you start working with multiple layers. So let's go into more detail about the various marquee selection tools here. These are tools to select different parts of your picture. This top one draws a box, and by holding the mouse button down and dragging my cursor, I can select boxes of different sizes and shapes, and I can jump back to the Move tool by pressing the V button here. I'll push that and I can move it. I don't want that, so I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo it. That's an extremely useful shortcut. Control-Z undoes one step. If you push it again, it will redo it, which no other app in the world behaves like this. I don't know why Photoshop does that. Control-Z undoes and then redoes your last step. If you want to undo multiple steps, you have to, let me just make multiple different mistakes here. You have to hit Control-Alt-Z. So back to the Marquee tool. I'll draw a box here. You can add to that selection. This is important to understand by clicking this second button on the toolbar here. So if I click that now, if I draw another box, I'm going to be adding to the selection. If I had the default selection here, it will forget my previous selection every time I try to draw a new box. This third button here is subtracting from a selection. So with that selected, when I draw a second box, it's going to take away from it. This fourth tool here isn't that useful. It's the intersection. So now when I draw a new selection here, it's only going to be the overlapping part that remains. I'm going to hit Control-D to undo the entire selection. Let me show you the keyboard shortcuts for that real quick. I'll just draw a first box. To add to it, I'll hold down the Shift key. To subtract from it, I'll hold down the Alt key on a Windows computer or the Opt key on a Mac. Those keyboard shortcuts will save you a lot of time, so try to practice with those. You'll also notice that there's an elliptical marquee tool, and this is sometimes useful for photographers. You can draw circles and ovals with it. If you want to draw a perfect circle, hold down the Shift key. That will lock you into making a perfect circle. It's really useful if you want to select a moon or something else in the real world that is a perfect circular shape. Now, jumping back up to the toolbar here, you'll notice a really useful feature, and that's feather. By default, when I draw the circle here, you can see it has perfect, crisp edges. You don't often want perfect, crisp edges when making selections in Photoshop with real photographs because your pictures are almost always just a little bit blurry. You can make a perfectly blurry selection by using feathering. So I'll deselect that and go back to my tool here. I'm going to set this to 30 pixels so you can see what the effect is. As I drag a circle here, and I'm going to hit V to move it, you can see it's creating a much more natural, even selection. It's not all black or white, it's shades of gray with the selection. We'll use feathering a lot in the upcoming tutorials. Now there are a couple other tools here. I'm holding my mouse button down to bring up this submenu. The single row marquee tool and the single column marquee tool literally select one row of pixels, and it's not something you ever really use in real world photography. So let's go down to the third button, which are the various lasso tools. Lassos allow you to select something on your picture just by drawing with your hand. So I'm just moving around with the mouse, and I select that, and now I'm hitting V, and you can see I can just move it around. If I deselect that, I can explore the other lasso tools. Polygonal lasso tool, just by clicking, I can draw a multifaceted shape, and on my last click, I'll double click, and that just closes the loop. Now by hitting the V key, you see I can move that selection. Not that useful for photographers. The magnet lasso tool is a little bit more useful. I'm just going to hold my mouse button down and kind of roughly drag around the bird, and you can see it's not perfect, but it's kind of grabbing onto the edges. Even if I vary away a little bit, it will suck over to the edge of the feathers there. So it makes it a little bit easier to select edges. I wanted to show you that tool, but there are actually much better ways to select around edges. So I'm just going to hit Control D to clear that selection, and we'll move on to a much more useful tool, the Quick Selection tool and the Magic Wand tool. Now, first of all, there's a lot of history in the Photoshop app, and for that reason, you're going to see a lot of tools that are outdated, and there's going to be a lot of tools I'll tell you never to use because Photoshop added a better tool, but they didn't get rid of the previous tool. So there are a lot of useful tools. And the Magic Wand tool, I still use it sometimes, but generally the Quick Selection tool is more useful. Here's how Magic Wand works. It will select a part of your picture based on the contents of it. So that was pretty remarkable, right? I just clicked the Magic Wand once and it selected this entire background. Now, for example, I could just delete this. Well, let me just turn off this as a background layer. We'll get into layers later. But I can just delete that. And that was pretty good. It did a pretty good job of selecting around the feathers, and it's not perfect, but it's really close. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. Actually, Control Alt Z a couple of times. I had to go back 2 steps. So now we're back with our bird here, and you'll notice a couple of really important settings for using the Magic Wand tool. The first up here is tolerance. You generally want some level of tolerance. Tolerance tells Photoshop that it will continue to select parts of the picture, even if the color is very slightly different. And if we zoom in deep here into this picture, I'm hitting Control Z and pan around a little bit. Notice I'm holding the spacebar down to allow me to pan. You can see there's little bits of variation in here, a little bit of JPEG compression. So if I set this tolerance to 0, you can see it didn't select the whole background. It kind of got stuck in little areas where the brightness of the sky was very slightly different. So if I set the tolerance to 1, it got a little bit better. So there's some level of tolerance that will give you the ideal selection. You generally want the tolerance to be as low as possible, where it still does a pretty good job of selecting. One thing to know is sometimes you'll find that it just over or under selects a little bit. And that's when it's good to know how to use your lasso tool. If you wanted to add something to it, hold down the Shift key. Remember, that's adding to the selection. And then circle the part that you want to select. And it will add it to the selection. If you over-select it, if the wand selected more than you want, hold down the Alt key and then circle it with the lasso tool to remove that part of the selection. So the Magic Wand tool, pretty useful. A related tool, also accessed with the keyboard shortcut W, is the Quick Selection tool, and it's more useful. With the Quick Selection tool, you can drag your cursor over parts of the picture, and it will try to find the edges of it. You just don't want to go outside the bounds of your selection. So you can see I'm just kind of meandering the cursor around the edges here, and it does a pretty smart job of just selecting the bird. Now, if I want to make this bigger, to cover a bigger area, I hit the right bracket key. And if I want to make it smaller, I hit the left bracket key. That's the same as you will use for brushes. So for some of this finer detail, I have to kind of make it smaller. Now, again, Shift Add and Alt to subtract. So I hit the Alt key and just managed to deselect that part of the bird between his legs. And, there are a couple of little mistakes here, like this edge here, over-selected. And that's just always going to happen. It's never going to be perfect. So you hold down the Alt key and you kind of go back and repair it. And then, what do you know? I did too much, so maybe it's easier at this point for me to actually zoom in and just re-add it in there. So there's some of that layer of refining you can do. And then once you get it as close as you can actually improve it a little bit further by using the Refine Edge tool. And I'll go into that in more detail when we actually dig deep into these selections. Now, if you're a keyboard shortcut person, and you should learn the keyboard shortcuts, it'll save you a lot of time. You can hit W to quickly jump over to whichever of these two tools you last used. You can see if I last used the Magic Wand tool, it'll automatically select the Magic Wand. If you want the other one, hit Shift W. and it will alternate between those two tools. That applies for any of the different tools, just Shift and whatever the keyboard shortcut is. The crop tool, terribly useful for photographers, though incidentally I typically recommend that you don't do cropping in Photoshop. If you use Lightroom and Photoshop together, edit the whole picture in Photoshop and then crop in Lightroom. Because too often I edit the picture in Photoshop and then I want to go back and uncrop it a little bit. I want to go a slightly wider angle. Maybe I need to make a print, an 8x10 print that requires me to add some size to it. Then I realize I have to redo all my edits. So it's easier to do all your cropping in Photoshop. But if you want to crop, you can use that crop tool and it will actually make the sizes a little bit smaller. These other tools aren't something that you typically use for photography, the more design-oriented tools. The eyedropper tool here is really, really useful. What the eyedropper will do is pick a color from your picture. So let's say I want to pick a color from the sky here. Now I'm going to make this a little fatter so we can see the color palette down here. This shows you the current color of your brush that you'll use for painting. So I pick that color of the sky there. Now what I can do is add that to a different picture. So let's grab this picture of Chelsea here. You can see she has a very white sky. Now that I have the blue sky from the other picture copied in there, I'll use the magic wand tool here to select the sky. And there's one more trick I want to show you with the magic wand tool. I had the contiguous check mark selected here, which means it skipped over this spot here. If I deselect that checkbox, it will go ahead and search the whole picture. And that really overdid it. But I can easily fix that with the lasso tool. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then just get in here and deselect a lot of this stuff. So the Alt key will subtract that for me. Now my selection's a little bit better. So I have blue selected here in my color palette, and anything I paint with a brush or with the fill tool is going to fill in with that color. So we'll jump to the fill tool in a little bit, but for now I'm going to grab the paint bucket tool and click in the sky, and you can see I transferred over the sky from this picture to this picture, at least the color from the sky, not the exact sky. So it's really helpful to be able to grab a tool, a color from that. You can also just click that palette and pick a specific color manually, but in the real world you'll usually want to choose a specific color from part of your picture to copy it over a little bit better. There's also a ruler tool here, which can be useful to measure part of your picture, but only if you've set the dimensions of the picture in the image size toolbar here, the image size tool. So another useful tool is the patch tool, and you're going to be doing a lot of this in photography. So let's jump over to a portrait. The patch tool is extremely useful for healing parts of your picture. Let's say I want to get rid of this spot of makeup here. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-0 to zoom into 1:1, 100%. And now I can just draw just a rough selection around it, and I'm going to drag that somewhere else. Bam! It's gone, and it looks perfect, right? The patch tool is just incredible. I just find it incredibly useful. So to do that again, all I did was I selected the part I want to get rid of, and then I dragged it to a part of the skin that I wanted to copy from. So you select, and then you tell it, hey, where should I get the new material from? Oh, go a little bit bigger on that. You can also use like the marquee tool here. I just hit the M key and use that to draw a particular shape, and then switch over to the patch tool. So you don't have to select it with the patch tool, but you can. There are a bunch of useful tools in here for photography. The spot healing brush tool and the healing brush tool are both terribly useful. The spot healing brush tool, you can see, you just click stuff and it goes away. It's amazing, right? It looks just completely flawless to my eye. The healing brush tool is a little bit different. So with the spot healing brush tool, I just click, and I don't care where it copies it from. Photoshop is pretty smart about it. It's not perfect. For example, I bet if I were to try to, I'll pan up a little bit here. I bet if I were to try to take out the shadow here right next to the hairline, you can see if you zoom in, if you look closely there, you can see it actually copied a few extra hairs onto her forehead. I don't want that. I'm going to undo that with Control-Z. So this would be a good time to use the healing brush tool. The only difference is spot healing brush, Photoshop gets to pick where it copies from. With the healing brush tool, you get to pick. So the first thing you're going to do is, this is your brush, and I'm going to do a right bracket to make that a little bit bigger. I'm going to hold down the Alt key to tell it where I want it to copy from. And now it's picked my origin. And you can see it's even showing me what it's going to paint on. So now I can go in and select, just try to get rid of some of those shadows, basically. So that just lets you more intelligently select it. If I were to, say, pick a spot in her hairline here and then paint over here, you can see it just starts adding some hair in there. It doesn't just copy it. That would be the clone tool. It intelligently copies it and tries to blend it in to make it look natural. And both those tools are just incredibly useful. You're going to be using them all the time. And there's actually, there's more to it than that. But that is most of what you need to know. The content-aware move tool. Let's check this out. Let's go back to one of these pictures with a little simpler background. Let's say I just wanted to follow the rule of thirds a little bit better and move this bird a little bit more towards the right side of the frame. I'm just going to select the bird roughly here. And with this move tool selected, I'm just going to move him to the right. Bam. I moved it. Right? You want to see that again? I'll Control Z a couple of times to move them over here. And I move it. And you can see, once I hit Enter, it fills in the background. It just did a beautiful job of it. Now, what if I did that with the Move tool? If I do it with the Move tool, there's just white in there because that's the background color as defined here. Anyway, if you need to move a subject, especially if it's on kind of a plain background like that, the Move tool is terribly useful. Let's say we want to move one of Asia's eyes. I don't know why you want to do this, but I'm hitting Control minus to zoom out a little bit. Now, let's grab that Move tool here, trace around her eye, and let's just move that right up to her forehead. Once I hit Enter, it's going to process it. Freaky stuff. Okay, I got to undo that. That's too freaky. Control Alt Z. There's a couple other useful tools in here. Well, the red eye tool. I don't have a good way to simulate this, and Lightroom does kind of I prefer to use Lightroom for this kind of stuff. But with the red eye tool, you would just draw a circle around the red part of somebody's eye, and Photoshop will automatically fix the red eye for you. Let's move on to the brush tool. Brushes are extremely useful, and even if you aren't doing painting, you'll need to understand how brush tools work because you'll use them to modify layers and masks later on. So you can control the size of the brush tool easily by using the left and right brackets, and it's going to paint whatever is set in the foreground color here. So if I wanted to paint some more eye makeup, I could use the eyedropper tool here, pick blue, and now switch to the brush tool, and now I could just edge in some more blue here. This is much more gracefully done with layers, so it's literally just painting on her face and it doesn't look very natural. You'll notice that this has really hard edges, and you probably would never want that in photography. Instead, you'll want a nice soft edge. So you can modify that by clicking this, and here you can see you can specifically select the size and hardness. And Photoshop includes some samples brushes here, as well as brushes with unnatural shapes, and we'll get into more of that later. But for now, let's just pick that same brush, but with a hardness of 0. So now when I paint it in, you can see the edges are nice and soft. So that's what it looks like with a soft edge and hardness set to 0, and this is what it looks like with hardness set to 100. So you'll be adjusting the hardness up or down constantly. Another way to make the edges even softer when you need to is to make a really big brush. So I'll set the hardness to 0, and with a nice big brush, you can see now the edges are even softer. Another important setting to see here is the opacity setting. So with 100 set, it's going to just completely fill it in 100%, just overriding everything. And with the opacity set something lower, like 17%, you can make just very smooth, minor refinements, adjusting the color. Now, it doesn't make much sense to paint people's faces, but I want you to understand the brush tool because you will be using that when you do everything from cloning to dodging and burning, making things brighter and darker. Those same controls work. If you want to undo a bunch of stuff, I find it useful to go to the histogram panel here. I'm opening up window history, not histogram. I did that incorrectly. History. And I'm just going to scroll up to the top and select this. And that just undid all of my mistakes. So I can start fresh. Now there are a couple of variations of the brush tool. The pencil tool here, it just uses a different brush. So it draws it more like a pencil than a regular brush, but I don't find that useful in photography. So let's move on to the very old school way of healing things. This is a tool that's mostly outdated, not completely outdated, but you'll probably use the healing brush tool more than you will the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool literally just copies part of the picture. So I'm going to use my brush experience here and use the right bracket to make that brush bigger. Just like with the healing brush tool where I had to press the Alt key or the Option key to specify the original part of the picture I want to copy from, I've got to hold down the Alt or Option key here and select the part of the picture where I'm going to copy from. And now I can just paste that wherever I want. Now you can see the opacity is set to 71%. So it wasn't doing 100%, which would cause it to just be a little more clear and to completely eliminate the background. So that's a clone tool. And in the real world, it's usually better to have Photoshop sort of fill in and blend the edges a little bit nicer. But with a nice soft brush, that can be a pretty effective tool. And I find for things like filling in something over a brick wall, the clone tool is still useful because there's such a rigid geometric pattern. If you were to try to use content-aware healing with a brick wall, it would end up not being quite so perfect. So there are still times to use the clone tool. The other option here is the pattern stamp tool. Let's go ahead and get rid of her cheek eye, as attractive as that is. Once again, I'll just go back to the history and just get rid of that. The pattern stamp tool stamps whatever pattern you specify. And so right now, I'm just pasting whatever pattern it has selected, which is here. And so it's just a way of painting. And there are times when you want to use this for photography. You'll often establish a pattern that looks like it could be a random pattern. And you'll use that to simulate snow or rain in your picture. And we'll just get into that later. But for now, I'm just going to undo all of that. Here's another useful tool, which is the History Brush tool. So, you know what? Let's go back to the stamp tool. I'm going to press S. And I'm just going to clone a couple of copies of Asia's eyes around here. The History Brush tool is terribly useful because to use it, I'm going to want to view the history panel here. The History Brush tool paints from earlier versions of your photo. So you select where you want to paint from by clicking next to the version of the picture on the left here. So if I just want to paint from the original picture, I can go through here and just undo that. And that actually allowed me to skip a step because you remember I pasted this eye second. So it's a really useful way to kind of undo some part of your edits without undoing everything, because sometimes what will happen is you'll make 50 changes and you want to undo changes 25 and 26. The easiest way to do that is to set the History Brush tool to some point in your history when your picture was right. And then with a soft brush, generally just paint over that part of it. So it just lets you pull in parts of your original picture. The Art History Brush tool, you probably won't use in photography much. It just allows you to modify it a little bit in an artistic way. Another tool it's a tool that used to be really useful that is no longer especially useful is the Eraser tool. And this will make more sense if I actually show the layers panel over here. If I erase something, well, it's erasing it and it's appearing white because the background here is white. I have the opacity set to something less than 100. So right now it's actually erasing it, but there's only one layer. So we can't actually see what's going on. It looks exactly like I'm just painting white. But let's make a layer from the background. And so now when I erase, you can see a checkerboard pattern. And that checkerboard means it's transparent. If I were to save this as a PNG, for example, dropping it on a website, I would be able to see the background through that. If I had multiple layers in here, I'd be able to see the underneath layers when I erase it like that. So I just dropped in this picture of a bird here. So now we can see as I erase the layer, the lower picture starts to appear. If I wanted to undo that, do you remember how to do that? The History Brush tool, right? I'll select the History Brush tool here. And because I still have it set the original picture, you can see I can basically unerase it. But erasing is you'll probably never need to erase anything, because nowadays we use layers to accomplish that same task. And we'll get into layers in a different video because that can be a little bit complex. Let's go back to history and just get this back to its original state. The paint bucket tool and the gradient tool are actually pretty useful for photography, but not in the way that you might imagine. The paint bucket tool just fills up everything with the foreground color. And you can see it's working just like the magic wand tool. It has a tolerance set here. So if I were to set it to a tolerance of 100, it would just fill up everything, basically. If I set it to a tolerance of 0, it won't fill up quite as much. It's going to be a very small point. Now, you're not usually going to paint over your photos using the paint bucket tool. Instead, you'll be using the paint bucket tool to modify masks. And the same applies with the gradient tool that's on the same toolbar button there. The gradient tool, you can see here it's set to go from blue to white, which is the foreground to the background color here. And as I drag my cursor, it's just going to make a line, but it's going to fill it in. So wherever it starts, it's going to be pure foreground color, and wherever I end drawing, it's going to be pure background color. So if I do a long line, it's going to be a nice smooth gradient. If I do a short line, it's going to be a sudden gradient. And anything off either end is going to be pure of that color. You have a few different options here. You can pick from their kind of standard color palette if you wanted to. Again, I find this mostly useful when using layer masks. You can use a layer mask and a gradient tool to very smoothly make the sky brighter or more blue without it being visually detectable. It's terribly useful, but we'll get into it more when we do layers. Let's get back to the original here. The blur, sharpen, and smudge tool. Again, these are tools that were useful in earlier versions of Photoshop. Nowadays, there are better ways to blur things and to sharpen them. But for now, I will show you what they are. Very obviously, the blur tool makes things blurrier. So maybe you just wanted to make the skin a little bit blurrier. This isn't the right way to do a portrait, really. But you can see as I'm painting over it, there's less and less detail. It's just smoothing out the detail. It's not the right way to do portraits. Again, just wanted to show you what it was. The sharpen tool does quite the opposite. It looks for areas of contrast and actually highlights them. It makes the contrast a little more obvious. So as I paint over her nose, you can see little hairs that human beings have become more and more obvious, and that's ugly. So we'll undo that. The third tool here is the smudge tool, and let's get a nice big brush here. You can control the strength of it from here. The smudge tool just pushes things around, and it's just completely useless. There's a new warp tool. Well, new. It's been in Photoshop for like 8 years, but the warp tool does a much better job than this does. That's just, poor Asia. I'm so sorry I've done this to you, Asia. Let's undo all of that. Here are tools that are extremely useful to photographers. The dodge, burn, and sponge tool. And first let me say the names make no sense at all. Burn makes things darker. You would think burn might make things brighter, but as I draw on her head here, it just makes it darker. So if there's part of your picture that's overexposed and you just want to recover that, you want to bring the exposure down a little bit, you'd use the burn tool. There's a setting here, midtones, shadows, and highlights. It controls which part of the picture that you want to modify. So I was just bringing down the midtones, but I could also just make the highlights a little bit darker. Burning the highlights reduces the contrast in your picture because you're making the brightest parts darker. If you burn the shadows, you will make the contrast greater by making the shadows even darker. Let's go back to the original picture once again, and I'll show you that when I have shadows selected here, it's not going to make any difference to the midtones and highlights. You see as I drag it across her forehead, it does nothing. Once I get into the darker parts of her eyes, it makes it really obvious. If it's too much for you, usually you'll be dodging and burning with the exposure set to like 10%, just because you want to make subtle changes generally in photography. Burn makes things darker, dodge makes things brighter. So let's dodge those shadows back up, and you can see now her eyes are starting to get brighter again. And they're not going to look good because they've just been through all this processing. That's not a great way to do it. But you can see the effect that it's having. Once again, I can make the effect more powerful by cranking up the exposure slider here. And, you know, if I were to keep doing this, at some point it would stop having an effect because it's only affecting the shadows. Let's talk about the names a little bit. If you have ever done darkroom work, then you're nodding your head, like dodge and burn. That makes perfect sense. But most people who learn photography in the last 20 years aren't really doing any darkroom work. In a darkroom, you would use an enlarger to take your film negative and project it onto a white piece of paper that will eventually become your print. So it's projecting through your negative onto this white piece of paper, and it's still going to look backwards because the paper starts out white, and whatever light hits your paper is going to turn black. The whole process just works backwards. So if you want a part of your picture to be darker, you would let more light hit it. That's why they call it burn, because you're letting more light hit the parts of the picture that you want to be darker. You're burning it in. And then you would use a dodge tool, which looks exactly like this. It's a stick with like a piece of cardboard on it to cover up parts of your picture, keeping light from hitting your white piece of paper and making it darker. Therefore, blocking the light made parts of the picture brighter once it was finally developed. The burn tool, you'll notice it looks like this. That's because you're just exposing a hole and you're just shining light through the hole, making that part of the picture brighter. Sponge, I never even use a sponge in the darkroom, but I will say in Photoshop what the sponge does is it allows you to saturate or desaturate pictures. So you'll select whether you want to saturate or desaturate something, and then you can go through here and you can see the brush is just making it more and more saturated, or, you know, eventually I could go down to black and white here. You probably won't use the pen tools much. The text tool is mostly useful if you're going to want to make graphics. You can see it's really small right now, but I'll hit Control-A to select all that and then make the text bigger. Notice I'm dragging over the icon here to make it bigger. But that just lets you draw text. You might end up doing that as a photographer at some point, so I wanted to show you where that tool was. You might also end up drawing shapes at some point, though this might be done more when you're using masking. But these are pretty self-explanatory. They'll use whatever the foreground color is and allow you to draw a variety of different shapes. Hold down the Shift key to keep them regular, in other words, to make a perfect square or to make a perfect circle. You can see they do things like allow you to control whether there's a border or not. The hand tool here, I've actually been using it, but I never selected it. The hand tool, if you zoom in further into the picture, the hand tool just lets you pan the picture around. And it's so useful they gave it the #1 keyboard shortcut, which is the space bar. So let's say I'm selecting different parts of the picture, holding down the Shift key, and I want to pan down. Rather than hitting the hand tool and then doing this, or rather than using these stupid scroll bars, I'm just going to hold down the space bar. And with the space bar held down, my icon changes from whatever tool I'm using to a hand. See, as I hold it down, it just switches for you. So hold it down, pan it around. It works in Lightroom too. You'll just get used to it. Once you practice keyboard shortcuts, you'll just be doing that without even thinking about it. The last tool down here is just the zoom tool, but I don't really use that either. Instead, what I'll do is I'll hit Control- or Control+ to zoom in. Zooming's terribly useful. Hit Control-0 to fill the screen like that, or hit Control-Alt-0 to zoom all the way in 1:1. Once you zoom in 1:1, you could go even deeper. It'll show you here where you're zoomed to 300%. Also shows it down here. That is the basics of Photoshop tools, and in future videos we'll dig deeper into the most important tools, but that should be enough to get you started. Thanks so much for watching.